Whiston from Boxing Will Weekly here, speaking with the renowned writer and commentator Corey Erdman, as heard on DAZN or as seen or read on Boxing Scene. And we are here to preview the mega fight and one of the best fights that people are talking about since probably Mayweather versus Pacquiao, Spence versus Crawford for the undisputed welterweight championship of the world. And I'm going to start with that comparison all in itself. Do you think that comparing it to that fight is a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that in terms of magnitude, both when you include just how much the general public cares about it, but also the quality of the fighters involved and where they are in their careers, I think that is a fair comparison. I do think that, whereas Mayweather and Pacquiao were both probably on the back nine or probably, on like whole 16, 17, 18 of their careers when they finally fought. Spence and Crawford, while, they're a little bit more advanced in age than maybe we had hoped they would have fought initially, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily in the autumn of their careers. They're probably both very much in their prime. So it differs in that respect. But in terms of the magnitude, this won't touch Mayweather Pacquiao numbers in terms of pay-per-view, but if we're looking for, hey, what is the biggest fight since then, it is probably this one.
And I'm going to stick with in comparison. So obviously we got another big fight this year that actually did well in the box office, Gervonta Davis, Ryan Garcia, and it, reportedly did over 1 million buys. From a boxing purist standpoint, which is both where you and I stand, do you hope for the sake of God that this fight does better than that?
yeah, like in a sense, probably not in the way that you're thinking. Like, if Ryan and Gervonta outsell this fight, great. Like good for them. That's growing the sport in its own way, and ultimately, the viewers will speak in terms of what is interesting to them, what are they willing to spend money on. But I do know what you're saying. That this is a better fight than that one. So, if we want boxing to be kind of a meritocracy, you would love to see this surpass that in numbers so that we could say, yes, excellent fights do big numbers. This is proof of that. And hopefully then it'll set off the dominoes for more and more of them to happen. I don't know whether it will or not. And that, frankly, that props to both Garcia and Davis for how well that pay-per-view did, because they were able to tap into, I think, maybe a different, at least a fraction of a different marketplace than this one will. I think that there is a very young, very online audience that was particularly interested in that fight. And many of them may also be interested in this one, but I'm not sure exactly how many. Now, on the flip side, there may be people who weren't interested in that fight who, probably not justifiably said, oh, they're still growing. These are young fighters. I don't need to spend the money on this. There will be people that are interested in Spence Crawford that weren't into that fight. So you hope that that can make up the difference. But it's definitely not a sure thing that this will outsell Davis Garcia.
And before I get further into that, I want to stick with the comparisons. So, from your perspective, when we're talking about all-time super fights, especially when right around this division, like the Four Kings back then, where do you rank Spence versus Crawford, and what is the best comparison from a super fight perspective?
I mean, in terms of what it is as a fight, I think that you're thinking about something like a Leonard Hearns, and I don't want to say that these are kind of apples to apples comparisons, but I'm thinking of two welterweights in their primes that haven't fought one another yet. And of course, there are many differences. I mean, Leonard and Hearns were much younger when they fought one another. They kind of got to it a hell of a lot faster than Spence and Crawford were able to. So there's that. In terms of the magnitude, this is probably the most significant fight of our generation. This is our generation's super fight. And it's very hard to compare fights in terms of their grandeur, in terms of their magnitude over eras. I mean, it's just as it's hard to compare fighters from era to era because so many things have evolved. Fighters are different. Athletes are better. Competition is different. Fighters fight less often. When it comes to comparing events, boxing of yesteryear just had such a grip on the mainstream sports audience. So you're never going to be able to have the percentage of the marketplace that you had in the 20s, in the 30s, and the 40s. Like nothing will ever probably ever hit the magnitude of like a Dempsey Tunney or a Louis Schmeling, or then going into the 70s with Ali and Frazier. Like, it's just hard to hit that magnitude for all the reasons that we talk about all the time. There's more on TV. Boxing has kind of faded into the background a little bit, but for our generation, this is the best that we have to offer. And so I don't want to yuck anyone's yum here. I want everyone to be excited about this fight, and you don't need to worry that it won't have 100,000 people there like Dempsey and Tunney did, or it didn't have like 50% of the country watching like at Ali Frazier. That's just not going to happen. But this fight is going to happen, and we've been calling for it for a long time. We've wanted it for a long time. We should be able to enjoy it.
I completely agree. I saw a comparison from Stephen Breadman Edwards. He said, another boxing scene writer, he said that the best stylistic comparison he could come up with is Oscar Tito. What do you say?
I like that. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. I think that's a more modern comparison. I think that doesn't ruffle as many feathers as saying, Leonard Hearns.
Yeah.
That understandably is put on a pedestal, and for very good reason. But yeah, stylistically, I like that comparison, and certainly I respect where Breadman's coming from with that.
Okay, now I want to get back to the promotion of it, the pay-per-view buys, what sells today. And that is obviously controversy. That is trash talk. That is, stuff happening at the press conferences, stuff happening at the weigh-in. So far, that's not the case for Spence Crawford. And to be honest, even talking to them today, it sounds like that's not going to be the case. They're not looking to, enter that side of the promotion. They're looking to keep it the way they've kept it, which is respectful of each other's talents and what they've done in their career and their resumes. From your perspective, where do you sit on the fact that fights nowadays almost kind of need that stuff to happen for it to buy, and maybe the styles themselves won't sell it enough?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's unfortunate because that kind of is like, that's what drives views and drives articles at this point now, is being able to have kind of a flashy moment to tie your article into, a big controversial moment to share the video of. Like, those things do help. That's absolutely true. Now, I don't think it's entirely necessary to have a very successful fight. I don't think you necessarily need those things. And I also understand why it's not happening right now. You have to remember that this fight basically got over the line because these two got on the phone with one another and figured it out. Yeah. So I think that there probably was a lot more animosity, personal heat between these two, you'd say 6 months ago and prior to that. But I think that these are two men that they're going to fight one another. I think that, like, as athletes and as men, they want to prove something to one another and to the audience by extension. But, after you get on the phone with one another and you're probably, you're asking each other questions and you're connecting on a personal level, it's probably not as easy for them to tap into that kind of trash talk right now. And it might feel just not genuine. They might not be feeling it right now. But in a couple weeks, as these guys are a little bit deeper into training, they've been asked the same questions a million times. They're getting hungry. They're getting tired. They're going to see one another a little bit more often. I think that you'll see a little bit more of that because, we saw even in the introductory press conference, these two guys are kind of clever with the trash talk. And, both these guys are kind of funny. So I think that we'll get our moments, but you're probably not going to see like Larry Holmes, like jumping off a car or like trying to clothesline anyone or anything like that. I don't think we're going to get anything like that. I think the fight ultimately is going to have to sell itself on its own merits.
And what do you think about the promotion so far? So I have a couple gripes with it, just from a personal standpoint. One, you look at when they announced Davis Garcia, Showtime and PBC, when they announced Davis Garcia, immediately came that flashy gold and blue or whatever it was poster with the two of them. For the longest time, they announced this fight with just the usual black and white, what's on our website, simple poster for literally the greatest fight, like I've said, since Mayweather Pacquiao, and what boxing has been known for as a staple. As this, you can look at a poster and go, this is this fight, this was that fight. It just so historically, boxing lives off of what the poster promotion was. Now they have one that's significantly better, obviously, but also just from a social media standpoint across the board, whether it is Showtime or PBC or other people in general, you're not really seeing the promos that, like you said, are including the heat that did exist, 6 months ago or 4 years ago with these two guys. I just feel like we're 2 weeks out from the biggest fight in what we're saying since Mayweather Pacquiao, and from a promotional standpoint, it almost doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, I think that we have this conversation very often, you know, like when we're leading up to a big fight, we always say something similar to this, like, oh, it doesn't feel like, and then fight week comes, and then we don't care anymore, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I certainly understand what you're saying, like, you know, yes, like would we have liked kind of a flashier poster, you know, something that was a little bit more iconic? I'm sure that absolutely would have helped, but I do think that they're approaching this, is what we're talking about, right, is who the audience for this fight is. And I think that they are going a little bit more traditional, a little bit more mainstream. You know, the focus has been on getting these fighters through the ESPN car wash, getting them on Sports Center. It's a lot different than some of the stuff that they were doing with Davis Garcia, which, you know, they had Snapchat promos, they had TikTok filters, you know, they were really honing in to new media, new forms of social media. Now, you might say, is it short-sighted to not have those things for this fight? I suppose so, and we'll see if they can come up with some of those things. But I think that the strategy for the marketing of this fight is a lot different. But keep in mind, these are the same people that just put that fight on too, and it did very well. So I want to trust that what they're doing is good, and that they know what they're doing. But we'll see ultimately if some of these things, if not having, you know, a more modern fight promotion, shall we call it, will hinder them when it comes time to tabulate all the pay-per-view buys.
Yeah, it's just from my perspective, obviously being a new boxing fan and knowing the importance of this fight and in comparison to other fights, I want it to hit the levels that it deserves to hit. When Canelo and Triple G fought the first time, I'm sure they were relatively around the same international appeal in terms of boxing fans worldwide, and probably not really all that much from a casual audience like Davis Garcia at that time for the first meeting. And that first meeting ranks, you know, top 10, top 5, depending on what list you're looking at, depending on how many buys you're looking at. That fight exists there, and this fight definitely deserves to be at that same level, and certainly above Davis Garcia. So if 2023 can provide 1.2 million buys for Davis Garcia, then from a personal standpoint, I really hope that it happens for Spence Crawford. But we'll move on to the fight itself, and I want to go through each aspect that everybody likes to talk about. We'll start with just, you know, question, and I'm not going to give it to you in a grand scheme. We're going to go question by question. So,
all right.
Who do you think hits harder? I've seen a lot of people say, especially fighters, they're thinking that Spence hits harder. And fighters specifically who fought both Spence and Crawford, Porter and Kell Brook said it. Kell, I feel like, was just, you know, going with what Porter said. But I think if he would have disagreed, he would have then made a statement. So Porter and Kell Brook both think that Spence hits harder. Where do you sit?
I mean, I have to agree with them because they've been hit by it. But also, you know, I spend a lot of time with Chris Algieri doing broadcasts together, and he, of course, was in there with Errol Spence, and he always marvels at just how physically strong Errol Spence is. And he always says people don't realize just how strong he is. You know, Errol walks around, you know, at like, I think he said like 175, you know, maybe 180. Like he's a light heavyweight sized human being that then cuts down to welterweight. And this is a guy that, you know, in high school was a running back too, right? He's a big kind of physical guy. And all we can go on is what past fighters have said, but also in the quantifiable way, I think that Errol Spence is probably the stronger of the two men in terms of raw strength. Now, punching power in a boxing ring comes from a lot of different things. I mean, the ability to knock someone out doesn't always mean you're physically stronger than, you know, a fighter being compared to. It matters, you know, speed, placement, all of those things come into play. It is true that Crawford has scored more sensational knockouts than Spence has. Now, that being said, his competition, by his own admission, has not been as strong as Spence's has at 147. So I think going off of the information that we have, I'll give the edge to Errol Spence, but you know, we're going to find out when they actually get in the ring. We'll see if they can hurt one another.
So then you can separate this into two different categories. So from the, you know, strength perspective, I agree with you. I'd probably edge Spence. From a finisher standpoint, would that go to Crawford?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, Crawford, you know, has a finishing instinct that I have always felt has separated him from other fighters, particularly at the highest level. I think that he takes a lot of joy in finishing guys off. You can really see it on his face when he gets a guy hurt. There's a smile on his face. He really looks like a movie villain when he's going in for the finish. Crawford is just a really talented knockout artist. We've seen it more from him in the past. So based on that, I'll give the edge to Terence.
Okay, smarter ring IQ. I feel like people, by default will say Spence from a fundamental standpoint, but I want to know if you have a different opinion.
My first instinct is actually to say Crawford, only because we've seen him win fights in a variety of ways, and probably in more different ways than we've seen Spence win fights. Mm-hmm. So I'm taking this question as kind of like, that's one way that I can quantify ring smarts, basically, right? That I've seen Crawford win rounds, win fights off the back foot. I've seen him walk guys down. Southpaw, orthodox. He's been able to mix it up quite a bit. And to me, that takes ring intelligence. Going back to the competition, though, another way that you can approach this is, well, it's all fine that we've seen Crawford do this against the caliber of guys that he's fought at 147, but Spence has been winning fights against tougher opposition. So, it's kind of like saying if you had two people and one was sort of the naturally smarter person, but the other one had actually gone through and studied and got a degree in that particular subject, who do you say is smarter? And so that's kind of what this is. Like, do I think that Crawford kind of has more, that he's tapped into a few more textbooks than Spence has in terms of how to win rounds, how to win fights? Yeah, probably. But Spence has also had his master's degree at 147, and he's going for his PhD now, right? So, I guess like I don't want to opt out of answering this question, but I think that you can kind of answer that one two ways.
Yeah, no, I really like that answer. From a speed standpoint, I would lean Crawford.
Yeah, I think that Crawford kind of has the snappier, whippier type punches than Spence does. That's not to say that Spence is slow by any means, but just raw hand speed, one punch pot shots and counters like that. That's not his game the way that it is Terence Crawford. So I would edge Crawford in that department.
So you brought up the level of competition at 147.
Yeah.
Everybody points to it. And while it is objective that, yes, Spence has had the better competition at 147, Crawford has decimated all of his opponents. Let's go to the biggest opponent for both of them, and they would both agree is the Shawn Porter win. People discredit Crawford. Well, I should say they discredit Porter in the Crawford win, and they think that there was a much better Porter for the Spence one. I want to know where you sit, because you look at it from a year standpoint, that was only 2 years of a difference. You look at it from how the fight was going. Porter was winning rounds in both fights, if not was winning the fight in the Crawford one until he got stopped. So I think both from what we saw on the night and just from, box strike, it's only been 2 years. From my perspective, those wins should count as equal, but I want to know from what you think.
Yeah, I think that they're mostly equal. I think that like if you were nitpicking, the fact that Porter walked away from the sport after the Crawford loss tells you that the better version of Shawn Porter was probably the one 2 years earlier, right? Because otherwise he would have continued fighting. But I mean, the version of Shawn Porter that showed up against Terence Crawford, as you mentioned, was winning rounds against him, right? Like Terence had to be told in his corner that he was behind, and then he really snapped into gear. And we have that sequence that we've all rewatched over and over of him basically turning it on and finishing the fight. But yeah, I would count those as mostly equal, but probably edge it towards Spence because, it was a younger version of Shawn Porter who at the time had no thoughts of walking away from the sport whatsoever.
Okay, so now let's go into more performances for the two of them. And I like to sit on the Spence side of things. You look at his last three. Obviously, all went the distance. All against high-level opposition. Yordenis Ugas, Danny Garcia, and I think it was Shawn Porter is the last three fights for Errol Spence. So in all of those fights, Spence was hurt at some point. Yordenis Ugas is the best example probably out of all of them. Yordenis knocks the mouthpiece out, and knocks Spence into the ropes, and Ugas doesn't do anything about it. he literally just stands in the center ring and lets Spence come back up, and obviously we know how that fight ends. Do you think that looking at those 3 fights, and I think I'm also the Mikey Garcia fight is the one I'm forgetting. If you include those 4 fights, and all of them, Spence was vulnerable at multiple points in those fights. Do you think that Crawford has the ability to get Spence into that position and then also finish the job right there and then?
I mean, I think that Crawford is obviously a very gifted fighter. I think that either of these guys are probably capable of knocking out anyone at 147 in the right circumstance. I would say that, like, I don't know that, like, Spence was really hurt in any of the fights other than the US fight. And even that one, I would put an asterisk on that because Spence basically lost his focus, had his hands at his side, and then took that shot from Ugas and nothing. And he still didn't go down, right? I mean, he took the best shot from one of the best 147 pounders in the world when he wasn't even looking. He basically got sucker punched, although it wasn't Ugas's fault. But for purposes of comparison here, and he was just kind of wobbled for a second and then got back into it. So some people will take that as an indication of vulnerability. For me, it almost affirms the opposite, because I was going into all those fights, obviously since the car wreck and the damage that Spence took, I have questions, or had questions, about his punch resistance coming out of that. I mean, how could you not? You have a life-altering, life-threatening accident where you endured head trauma and facial trauma. How could it not have some kind of effect? But it really didn't, and some of that was, I think, aided by the fact that the approach that he took against Mikey Garcia the first time out was a little bit more cautious. He chose to box off the back foot a little bit more.
Yeah.
But again, look, took a flush shot from Ugas, was able to shake it off and got back to it. I think that Spence has mostly shown that, he has a chin that's on par with anyone else in the 147-pound division. But again, like, how could you not be impacted in some capacity by what happened, right? Both these guys, I think, are capable of hurting one another, but both these guys have also shown to have rock solid chins at the same time.
And that's, I guess, another point that people like to bring up about Spence is just the question marks around where he is from a physical standpoint. You said that you also had questions going into those fights, but do you still have those questions?
That's always going to be in the back of my mind. And especially in a fight like this, where it is really 50-50. And these are the 2 best welterweights of their generation. What would it would always be in the back of my mind. How would Errol Spence have looked on this night if that hadn't happened? Right. And that's even if he wins, like, was there a better version of Errol Spence that was possible if not for that car wreck? It's hard for me to say the answer is no. Like, how could you not be impacted by that? Now, that may not be the difference between him winning or losing, but that will absolutely always be a question that's in the back of my mind. And probably when he retires, it'll be a question that he asks himself as well.
Is there any questions on the standpoint from Terence Crawford, who is obviously the older fighter?
I think the question for Crawford is more, what will he do now that he's in a more competitive fight than he probably has been in quite some time, right?
Yeah.
Like, the fact that he's so good means he's been able to dominate some pretty good fighters that he's been facing, although they haven't been top flight 147 pounders. And by his own admission, again, not quite as good as the guys that Spence has been fighting. And that was through no fault of Crawford's. That's just kind of the promotional situation that he was in at the time. The question for me is, is there not ring rust, but especially in the early rounds, is there that, like, whoa, okay, it's been a little while since I've been in anything close to a 50-50 fight. It's been longer for Crawford than it has been for Spence, I think, in that scenario. So that, like, and we're splitting hairs here in a fight this competitive and this even. Those are questions that you ask. I don't think that they, again, will necessarily define winning or losing. But when you're talking about 2 guys that are this closely matched, I think you have to ask those questions.
Who would you say is the bigger name?
Oh man, I would say probably Errol Spence. Oh. Although, like, Crawford's time on ESPN really, really benefited. You spend a lot of time fighting on ESPN, and that has such great currency when it comes to your standing within the boxing audience. But Spence being able to have those numbers at Cowboy Stadium and his cachet, I think in Texas alone, this is just my reflex reaction. I think maybe marginally Errol Spence, but I think it's pretty close.
Sticking with the subjectivity of the sport, everybody likes to talk about the pound for pound list. And people are in agreement that the winner of this fight shall be considered the #1 pound for pound fighter on the planet. I don't think that is an argument. You could argue Inoue and Canelo, and I would entertain those arguments. But from a promotional standpoint and just giving credit where credit is due, the winner of this fight shall be considered the #1 pound for pound fighter. But currently, where would you have him?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to argue, I mean, I've seen people have Crawford at #1, and I think that's fine. Like, I think that Crawford rightfully is or should be ranked a little bit higher than Spence, even as just one place ahead of Spence because of the work that he did at 140 and at 135, right? He went up through weight divisions, and we've seen him be elite moving up the ladder. And the way that we think about pound for pound, that tends to be weighted quite heavily. And so I think that he deserves credit for that. Yeah, I think the winner of this fight, I think they either can or should be #1 pound for pound. But I would say that, if Inoue destroys Stephen Fulton, I think that having him at #1 is not wrong either. And also, again, considering everything that Usyk has done and the way that he's performing at heavyweight, if you say that he's #1 as well, I don't think that you're wrong. So now, if Fulton beats Inoue, I don't know if he's had the longevity against the top level names the way that Inoue has to immediately put him at #1. But he certainly enters like the top 5 probably, right? So we have a bunch of fights coming up that make this very, very interesting. But there is going to be the temptation, and I'm going to feel it too, that whoever wins this fight, I think you elevate them to #1. And in some ways, that's almost kind of like the journalists and the fans' reward to the fighters. To say, hey, if you make fights like this, like, we're going to give you your flowers. And that's basically what's going to happen after this fight.
And I completely agree. You brought up AT&T Stadium. Was Vegas the right move for this fight?
Oh, money-wise, yeah, it has to be. Like, I think that it would have been cool to try this out in a football stadium and do big numbers. But we've seen that, even when Canelo does 70,000 in a stadium, it doesn't quite touch the gate numbers of a big Vegas fight. Just the prices that you can set tickets at in Las Vegas are so much higher than anywhere else. There's a reason that all these fights wind up there. So, I mean, this one is going to do a monster gate. I imagine it'll probably wind up, I don't know, like top 20 in the history of the state or something like that, which is a monstrous number, which puts it up there with some of the biggest fights in history in terms of profitability at the gate. It's a big fight, and big fights have to go to Vegas to maximize profit. And that's not just profit for the promoters, that's profit that goes to the fighters. Like, they should want it where it can make the most fighters. We're not just being greedy for the sake of being greedy. It's maximizing the profit so that the most money goes in the pockets of the fighters too.
Yeah, I completely agree. But this brings me to the discussed rematch that is more than likely, in all likelihood, going to happen. You get the rematch. Some promoters are a little bit more lenient on, okay, well, we made the cash. Now we can, test our theories at a bigger stadium. So do you think that if the rematch happens, if Spence wins it, that the rematch happens at AT&T, or do you even think it would matter whoever won it? Do you think it would happen at AT&T?
I think that there's going to be big site fee offers to keep it in Vegas no matter what. Yes, I can see, like, let's say if Spence wins, that maybe they try and pull it towards Cowboy Stadium. If Jerry Jones and the Cowboys, if they want to put up like a big site fee offer to try and bring it there, maybe that is compelling. But I think that this ultimately winds up right back where it is, like either at T-Mobile or at MGM. Just the money on the table there is just a little bit too much. And especially when you have two guys who are draws, it's difficult to take it to just one guy's hometown to do it that way, unless, again, there's kind of a decisive victory, but there's still a rematch. Maybe Spence tries to play that card and brings it to a stadium. Or on the flip side, maybe Crawford tries to bring it to Omaha. I don't know. But again, there's just so much more money to be made if you do it in Vegas, unless there's a big site fee offer in Texas to do it there.
So sticking with the rematch, obviously this fight took as long as it took to get to finally even getting a date attached to it. Assuming there is a rematch, how quickly do you think that gets done?
Well, quicker than this one happened, right? We probably won't wait 8 years or so. I think the complicating factor will be that Spence has been fairly open about the fact that he is waiting to move up to 154, right? Like his body is telling him, hey, it's time to go up. He's even talking about it on the All Access episode that has come out from Showtime as well. Yep. He's pretty open about that. So does Crawford want to go up to 154 right away? I mean, that will be a question. That'll be a complicating factor. It'll happen faster than this one did again, but there will still be some sticking points, and they will be exactly what you're bringing up. It'll be location and it'll be weight that will potentially throw some wrenches in making this happen a second time.
Is there any possible way you don't see a rematch happening?
I think if it's an absolute like one-sided,
no, not from a one side. I want to get into that after. Not from a one-sided. Just because they might not, like, say Crawford wins.
Yeah.
Crawford might not be willing to do anything other than, we're doing this again if we're going to do it at 147. He might not be willing to do it at a 150 catch weight or going up to 154 to match Spence. Like, that's not Crawford's problem, especially if he wins. So I know there is going to be a rematch clause, and from hearing from the fighters, it doesn't sound like there's anything in the rematch clause that states if this, if that. It pretty much just says, the loser is granted a rematch clause if they want it, but they would still have to come to, like you said, the agreement on these terms. So do you think that there's a possible scenario where it doesn't happen again?
Oh, yeah. I think, listen, okay. This is boxing, and there's like everything that we're bringing up could be something that ends this right away. But I think that that probability is lessening, especially that now that these two get along, they've been on the phone with one another, and they've connected on a personal level to make this happen. I would say that possibility is slim, but it could happen. I mean, but by and large, like big fights in boxing history that have happened that required a rematch, typically you do get them. So I think that we would probably get one if we need it after this one.
Okay, so now I want to get into the possible one-sided. Do you see any possibility that this fight could be a one-sided fight for either fighter?
I don't see this being a rout on the scorecards the way that you're thinking for either guy. I think that they're both too talented. I both think that they can make adjustments in such a way that I don't see a way that this is one-sided for either guy, provided it goes to the scorecards. I think that every round is going to be competitive. Even if one guy wins 120, 108 somehow, I think that every round is going to be nip and tuck. I think that it's going to be competitive no matter what.
Okay, my final question as we're running out of time here. And I asked it the same for, actually I got two more questions. One, Jaron Ennis. He's coming off his big win this weekend. Obviously, it was purposely done, 3 weeks out from Spence Crawford. It was supposed to be capped off with an Ortiz win as well, but obviously we know what happened there. From an Ennis standpoint, in terms of he's next in line, do you think the guy that you're seeing right now could beat either Spence and Crawford?
I think he has the best chance of anyone out there. And that is a heavy compliment because of how good these guys are. I would have serious questions about whether Spencer Crawford could beat him. Would they be favored? Yeah, of course. They've done more, and they're the established guys, but Ennis just has such a special set of tools. I think Al Bernstein said on the broadcast that he has the most diverse offense that he's seen in his 42 years of broadcasting. And that's saying something, like Ennis against Villa hurt him in basically every way and every different stance you can imagine, and then finish the job. And he was just messing around at points too. He was dancing, he was looking ringside, and that's against a top 10 fighter in Villa. He was doing that. He had no difficulty whatsoever. Did he get hit with some shots? Yeah, but it was primarily because he was messing around and just trying different things, and was succeeding in doing it every way that he felt like, right? So this is a really, really dangerous guy who I think is capable of beating anyone in the division.
Yeah, I agree. I was hoping that Ortiz would contest that argument, but he's obviously going to move up to 154 as he should. So my final question is the final question I asked for Taylor versus Serrano, and it deserves the same question for Spence versus Crawford. If you could describe this fight in one word, what would it be?
Awesome. This fight is awesome. Everyone should tune in for this one. Tell your non-boxing friends to come over for this one. I know it's $84, but split the pot. Find a way to get this fight on your television, or spend $500 and get in the door. But definitely don't miss this one.
Awesome, Corey. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Like I said at the top, renowned boxing writer and boxing commentator, as heard on DAZN or as read on Boxing Scene, as where he is right now. Thank you again for previewing Spence Crawford with me, and I can't wait for this fight.
Thanks for having me, man.
Cheers.